Welcome to my conversation with Steph, where she's going to ask me a bunch of questions about learning or productivity, which I don't know exactly what we're going to be talked about today. But every time I'm traveling, it seems that this is a good way of making some content because I'm usually too busy and I don't have a studio to set up everything. But at least I can keep providing you some value when I'm on the road. So yeah, Steph, what are we talking about today?
All right, so we've been talking a lot about encoding on the channel recently, and we've touched a little bit more on spaced repetition in one of our recent videos. So I think a lot of people are wondering, if not spaced repetition, then what are some better ways to do revision? So it's like we've talked about the encoding process. Now what's next after it's all been encoded?
So spaced repetition is still going to be necessary. It's just that it's only necessary for some parts of the information. I was actually doing a workshop today and this topic kind of came up. The idea of when is it appropriate to use something like spaced repetition or a memorization technique like method of loci or link method or story method or anything like that. And whenever you feel that you're entering into that sort of lower order learning kind of mindset, that lower order thinking. So again, that's that type of mindset where you think that's not going to stick. I need to just repeat this again and again. You can almost feel it sort of leaking out of your brain. That is your brain telling you, this is not something that's relevant. I don't get this. It's not going to stick. I don't see why I need to hold on to it. And you're feeling your brain almost ejecting it. That's kind of what we're feeling. So that's lower order thinking. And that's sort of the indicator for your brain that things could be taken up a notch. So when we feel like that, the first thing is, well, can we reduce that by flicking it up a gear, using some of our higher order thinking so that we're able to integrate that knowledge more and therefore improve our retention and improve our retrieval of it. If that's not possible, which for some subjects is as high as 30% of the content, where some subjects are as low as less than 5% of the content, we do need to learn it using lower order strategies. So lower order strategies, including something like Anki and flashcards and just the repetition and things like that. I'm pretty sure the last time I was in a hotel room talking to you, this was also the topic that we talked about. Yeah, so that's one aspect. It doesn't really matter which memorization technique we're using to fill that purpose, as long as it gets the job done, it's gonna be fine. Like lower order has a pretty low ceiling in terms of its effect. So any technique that hits that ceiling, it's gonna be fine. So flashcards okay, memory palace, method of loci, link method, story method, power system tables, all of these things are going to be perfectly fine. And there's lots of other videos, available to look at that. So that's going to be totally okay. It's important that you retrieve and do revision at higher levels of mastery, not only because of the fact that that is how we're tested and therefore we want to find gaps in our knowledge there before the exam hits, but also because of the fact that testing at higher levels of mastery also helps us with the higher levels of thinking in itself. It kind of allows us to calibrate our sense of learning. So in the initial encoding part, if we're not really sure whether we thought about it at a high level and whether we encoded it properly, when you test at that high level, we can calibrate that feeling like, oh yeah, I thought I did it well, and it turns out, yes, it did work. Or, oh, I thought I did it well, but it didn't quite work. And then that allows us to be more in tune with our learning at that metacognitive level. So other techniques that you could use outside of memorization is, using, your practice questions and past paper questions and things like that. But again, like what I've talked about in previous videos, I talked about in the live coaching session, right? And then also the USMLE video about how we can take a question and how we can create an answer sheet, how we can lead with uncertainty rather than needing to rely on answers and worked explanations and things like that. So that's one area that we can extend it out. A lot of people often say that teaching is a great way of revision, and it is. Teaching is a fantastic way of revision because it tests you at multiple different levels, but it also depends on how you're actually teaching it. For example, if I'm teaching you something and I just start from wherever I feel like I want to start and I just go like in a single linear order, starting from start to finish, going over like just whatever I can think of, almost just ranting, that is not testing at a very high level. Right? So why is that? Why do you think that that's not testing at a very high level?
Right, I think because when you're just going linearly, you sort of have to memorize the entire process. It has to go from A after B, after that is C. And you're not really linking together, and information is isolated. You're not finding out how are different concepts related to one another.
Yep, so that's true, but it's even a level beyond that, right? Because in order for you to teach effectively, you need to know where to start and what to go to next and what the next point is. So what that requires is more than just understanding that things are related, because that's kind of that mid to high level, understanding that there are relationships. But the level above that is understanding why those relationships are important and how they are important and in what context they're important. And so when you're trying to teach something, and if you're trying to teach something well, you're trying to figure out what is important and what parts do I need to emphasize and what parts do I need to start with, and then what parts can I fade away and what parts can I deprioritize or put later in my teaching. And that often requires us to restructure information and reorder information. So, teaching is a method that already a lot of people are using and they find good effect with. But some people use teaching and they don't actually find good effect with it. And it's not that the teaching as a technique is wrong. It's that the way that we teach it makes a big difference on how it forces us to think about things. Just like the type of question a practice question asks us changes the way that we think about that particular thing. A more difficult question makes us think at a higher level. So when we're teaching, we don't have that cue. So we need to hold ourselves to that standard. So figure out what the most logical possible flow is. One of the great Feynman sort of, he talked about this a lot is the idea of sort of teaching something to a 5-year-old or teaching something to a 10-year-old. But it's not in just teaching something to a 5-year-old that there is the value, right? You can't just use 5-year-old words and teach the entire topic for an hour. The idea is that you're able to package something simply and concisely, but comprehensively and accurately. There's no way you can be both simple, comprehensive, and concise without knowing exactly what it is that we're honing in on and we're trying to pin onto. And so teaching to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old is a good kind of approach to take. So that's a good technique. And then you could take it up another level. So you could do that, and then you could do, the level beyond that, which might be teach it to a 15-year-old. And you continue up until you get to the desired level that you want to get to. So yeah, so something like teaching will be a great technique as well. You can alternatively activate similar types of processes as you would when you're teaching, even without teaching. So a common method is called a brain dump. And a brain dump involves just sort of regurgitating everything that you know about something, and you can just write it out, linearly. And a linear brain dump is still effective. Make it even more effective at the higher levels by not only writing everything down, but then also mapping it out. So now you're testing on the connections and things. Or you could say, well, I'm going to create a map of only the most important ideas. And you could force yourself to prioritize the concepts and prioritize certain relationships. And the good thing about having a range of different options and knowing this will test me at this high level, whereas this will test me at this low level, is that you can use the technique that is right for where your gaps are and where your weaknesses are. And you can use the technique that you have the time for. Like doing a basic map of just the main ideas of a topic might only take 15 minutes. And that's testing at a very high level because it's requiring strict prioritization about the knowledge. So that's something that you could fit in when you don't have much time to study, but it's still effective revision and retrieval practice for that higher level of thinking. It's not going to be very good for the low levels, but it's going to at least hit some of the high level. And when you've got a little bit more time, maybe on the bus, you can do your flashcards for some of the low level stuff, and you can bridge the gap between the two by fleshing out that mind map later, or you can do the teaching. And so you can fill your time adaptively depending on what's available. And so the hallmark of someone that is at least an intermediate level learner is they understand how different techniques produce different effects, and they can use the right technique to produce the right effect.
I think that nuance of knowing when to use each technique to achieve the particular result that you want is something that not a lot of people appreciate. And what you say about the explanation and prioritization and thinking of where to even start explaining really resonates with me, because I was just having a teaching session with some of my tutoring students, and I find that when you're actually answering your exam questions as well, you need to be able to articulate your line of thinking in a way that is logical and easy for the examiner to award you points.
One thing is that some people will say that, they're not going to do a certain type of revision or something because it's too hard to do. But I mean, it's like, what about it is hard? Like, is your revision technique do a one-handed handstand on a balancing board and then recite it? Like, is it hard because you can't do that? Or is it hard because it's challenging your knowledge in a way that you're not comfortable with? And so you got to ask yourself, well, am I going to be challenged this way eventually? If the answer is yes, then you need to be in control of when that difficulty happens. You don't want that difficulty to occur for the very first time mid-exam, obviously. That's kind of the worst case scenario.
Yeah, that's the whole meme of studying well in advance, studying just before the exam, and then studying in the exam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So studying in the exam is, it's a bittersweet moment because you always think man, this exam would actually be quite fun if I wasn't actually getting assessed on it, if it wasn't actually weighted. That's not a great feeling to have. So placing that burden on yourself at an earlier stage of the process, it goes a long way.